Welcome back to The Explainer, everyone. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating framework from historian Richard Brookhiser. We're going to trace the dynamic, and let's be honest, often totally turbulent history of the United States. But we're not doing it through an endless, dry timeline of dates and battles. Instead, we're looking through the lens of its foundational documents. Brookhiser makes the case that to truly understand the American concept of liberty, we have to look at these specific, defining snapshots in time.
To really grasp the intense historical stakes of the American experiment right from the jump, we have to start with this visceral cry from Patrick Henry back in March of 1775. Now, he was addressing the Virginia Convention, which was actually meeting illegally at the time. Speaking these words out loud, that was an act of treason that literally could have resulted in his execution. But this quote perfectly captures the core thesis of our source material today. Americans were deeply concerned with liberty, they were willing to fight for it, and they were willing to die for it. It is absolutely the defining, exceptional idea that shapes the nation's entire identity.
So out of roughly 400 years of history, the source zeroes in on exactly 13 critical snapshots. Brookhiser calls this collection an album of liberty. And some of these are incredibly famous, carved into massive marble monuments, while others, well, they're obscure complaints written by everyday people you've probably never even heard of. But together they tell an incredibly cohesive story.
Okay, let's run through our roadmap for today real quick. 1. America's exceptional idea. 2. Liberty of conscience. 3. Expanding the vote. 4. Freedom on the global stage. And finally, 5. Maintaining the machine.
Starting right off with Section 1, America's exceptional idea, defining a nation through documents. We're looking at how liberty was established not just as some fleeting political goal, but as a permanent, enduring principle.
But hey, before we jump into our first historical snapshot, we need to define a word you probably don't use every day: remonstrance. It basically just means an official objection or complaint. Keep that in your back pocket as a fun piece of historical trivia because it perfectly sets up our first, pretty unexpected vignette, taking us all the way back to 1657 in New Amsterdam.
Which brings us to Section 2, Liberty of Conscience, the 1657 Flushing Remonstrance. So picture this scene. We're in New Netherland, which is modern-day New York. The Director General is Peter Stuyvesant. Now, this guy was energetic, highly effective, and famously sported a peg leg from a cannonball injury. But he was also a total tyrant and a rigid religious bigot. He firmly believed his specific branch of Calvinist Christianity was the only acceptable faith, period.
Well, things escalated incredibly quickly when Stuyvesant was confronted with a highly countercultural group, the Quakers. They didn't recognize social ranks, they actually let women preach, and they had zero powerful investors to protect them. So Stuyvesant ruthlessly cracked down. He expelled their ships immediately, he arrested women preaching in the streets, and he brutally whipped preachers in public, literally almost to death. He even went so far as to officially criminalize harboring a Quaker in your own home. No way, right?
But here is the crucial point: how the local citizens reacted. 30 men from a village called Flushing, and get this, none of whom were Quakers themselves, sent Stuyvesant a remonstrance. They bravely risked the governor's wrath to defend the religious liberty of others. And they based their argument purely on the Golden Rule, doing unto others as you would have them do unto you. According to the source, this is massively significant because these ordinary, everyday guys were articulating the absolute foundation of religious liberty, based on mutual respect, decades before famous philosophers like John Locke would ever write about it.
Let's jump ahead to Section 3, expanding the vote. The 1848 Seneca Falls Convention. We're in the 19th century now, examining a major, glaring shortfall in American liberty: the total lack of voting rights for women. This push was spearheaded by the brilliant Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Growing up observing politics, she keenly understood that without the ballot, nobody was going to advocate for women's interests.
And when Stanton and her colleagues sat down to write their agenda, she deployed what I can only call absolute strategic genius. Just think about the sheer audacity it takes to directly edit Thomas Jefferson. By deliberately changing his famous words to "all men and women are created equal" in their Declaration of Sentiments, she brilliantly tied the fight for women's suffrage directly to the founding DNA of the nation's exceptional idea.
But progress is almost never a straight line. Just look at this erratic timeline. Women who met property qualifications actually did vote in New Jersey starting in 1776. They were a recognized bloc known as the petticoat vote.
But they completely lost that right in 1807 due to some political scapegoating after a corrupt election. So it took until Seneca Falls in 1848 to formally demand it back on a national scale, and all the way to 1920 for the 19th Amendment to finally be ratified. Liberty, as the source points out, often involves immense shortfalls and painfully long recoveries.
And getting that demand for the vote into the Declaration of Sentiments? Yeah, it wasn't easy. Stanton faced serious resistance even from her own allies who thought politics was just inherently corrupting. Ultimately, 100 people signed the document, championed passionately by the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass. And here's my favorite fact. Amazingly, one signer, Rhoda Palmer, who put her name on the document in 1848, actually lived long enough to cast her first ballot in New York at the incredible age of 102 in 1918. Talk about a lifetime of dedication.
Moving into the modern era, Section 4, Freedom on the Global Stage. Tear down this wall. We're now deep into the tense, slow-motion conflict of the Cold War. And our focal point here is Ronald Reagan's 1987 visit to the divided city of Berlin.
To really understand the horrific stakes of the Berlin Wall, consider this number for a second. 137. By 1987, 137 people had died, shot, drowned, or suffered fatal falls simply trying to cross the wall. While that number might seem kind of small compared to the millions lost in the world wars, the source emphasizes that these deaths were peculiarly revolting. Why? Because they were happening right in the heart of a modern city to people who were literally just trying to walk a few blocks for freedom.
Which brings us to a fascinating mini-mystery. When President Reagan decided to give a speech at the Wall, how did one of the most famous lines in modern history actually survive the editing process? Seriously, the cautious diplomats at the State Department and the National Security Council desperately wanted to cut the line. They were terrified it was way too confrontational towards Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. Well, the inspiration for the speech didn't come from some fancy think tank. It came from the raw, unfiltered frustration of everyday people. A 30-year-old speechwriter named Peter Robinson was sent to Berlin to scout the location. Over dinner with locals, he heard their visceral anger. One man pointed out a guard tower and told Robinson, "One of us is the zookeeper and one of us is the animal." A woman at that same dinner passionately declared that if Gorbachev really meant his promises of openness, he should come and tear the wall down. Robinson took that raw human emotion and embedded it right into the speech.
The diplomatic establishment fought tooth and nail to remove it, but President Reagan stubbornly overruled his own advisors. On the very morning of the speech, riding in the car to the wall, Reagan reportedly said with this wry, determined smile, "The boys at State are going to kill me, but I'm going to say it anyway." It's a striking example of how a singular, uncompromising demand for liberty can just cut right through the noise of cautious bureaucracy.
Finally, Section 5, Maintaining the Machine, Grant meets Bismarck. To bring all these themes together, we're actually going to break chronology slightly and travel back to 1878 for a philosophical climax. This is basically a historical crossover episode between two titans of modern nationalism, former U.S. President Ulysses S. Grant, who was touring the world at the time, and Otto von Bismarck, the chancellor who unified Germany.
The source highlights a conversation between these two men that reveals profoundly different worldviews. Bismarck suggested that the great tragedy of the American Civil War was fighting one's own people, basically assuming the only goal was simply saving the Union. But Grant quickly corrected him. He stated clearly that while unity was the initial goal, they soon realized the war was actually about destroying slavery. You see, for Bismarck, the sheer power and unity of the nation was the ultimate goal. But for Grant, a nation's unity was entirely meaningless if it didn't serve the higher moral purpose of liberty.
And that brings us to the source's powerful central thesis. Liberty is not a perpetual motion machine. You don't just invent it, turn it on, and walk away. Over 400 years of history, from the men of Flushing resisting a bigoted governor, to Elizabeth Cady Stanton demanding the vote, to a young speechwriter listening to angry Berliners, liberty requires constant, active upkeep. The gears need oiling, the engine needs attention, it has to be understood, and it has to be upheld by its citizens in absolutely every generation.
So, as we wrap up this explainer on America's exceptional idea, I really want to leave you with a final, provocative thought. We've seen the 400-year journey, the erratic timelines, the brave individuals fighting for inclusion. We know the machine requires maintenance. So the question is, how will you help maintain the machine of liberty today? Thanks so much for exploring this incredible framework with me. Keep learning, keep asking questions, and I'll catch you next time.